So in 2010, I deployed to Afghanistan. So my children were 12, 10, and 6 at the time. So Mikey was the youngest. And I was gone for about a year. And on the back end, when I returned, we had some rough times, but it was particularly rough for Mikey. I tell people sometimes there's a little 6-year-old inside of him that's mad that his father abandoned him for a year, even though he understood at least as well as a 6-year-old could. But the thing was, he was really, really angry. And I think part of that was he just didn't have the words to speak to tell us how he was feeling. And so he just acted out his emotions. But I mean, he would lose his temper. There were times where he would climb out the window and run off down the street. We eventually had to nail his window shut. One time, we laugh about some of the things now on the backside, but one time he got really mad at me and he wrote "Dads Don't Rock" all over everything in his room, on his dresser, on his bed, on the walls, on everything in his room. But one of the, off and on, he would get really, really angry and he would just scream and throw this temper tantrum. And I would go in and then those moments, rather than like disciplining him, because what he needed was my presence, I would just hold him and he would fight and he would shout and tell me, "I hate you, leave me alone, quit holding me." And I would tell him, "No, I love you, son." And I would just hold him and I'd keep him wrapped up. And he would fight and squirm, and sometimes it was as long as half an hour, literally, until he just exhausted himself and fell asleep. And during those times, I mean, there was nothing for us to do. I mean, we were seeking counseling and all the things that you ought to do when you have those type of situations. But there was we had no recourse but to turn to Jesus, and we cried out to the Lord, "Please heal our son." And in time, God did that. I mean, Mikey is in a much better place now than he was all those years ago. So today we're going to talk about a man who was in that same boat. He had a son who needed healing and he had nowhere to turn but Jesus. And so we're in week 33 of Jesus' ministry. This is right after, or about a week after, no, this is immediately after the Transfiguration. So the one thing I talked about last week. And as Jesus and his disciples come down the mountain, we're going to see what happens. Now, I'm in Matthew chapter 17, verses 14 through 23, Mark chapter 9, verses 14 through 32, and Luke 9, verses 37 through 45. And again, they're color-coded. Mark is in black, and I start with Mark, and then I add in what's unique in Matthew, and then what's unique in Luke. And so I'm going to be doing that. Now I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'm going to talk a little bit and go through it that way this time. So just kind of follow along. And so we're going to start here. When they returned to the other disciples at the foot of the mountain, they saw a large crowd surrounding them, and some teachers of religious law were arguing with them. When the crowd saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with awe, and they ran to greet him. So let's get a picture of what's going on here. Jesus, James, John, and Peter had climbed the mountain where the Transfiguration happened. The other 9 disciples, they remained at the foot of the mountain, along with whatever crowd of people were following Jesus at the time. In the meantime, a scribe with a demon-possessed child had left home to seek out Jesus. Without a doubt, this was his last resort. Now, the scribes, we've not talked about the scribes much. We talked about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but the scribes were teachers and interpreters of the Torah and the Talmud. The Torah are God's commands in the Old Testament, in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. But the Talmud are all those extra rules that the Pharisees created, and the scribes were experts in figuring out what these things said and how to apply them in everyday circumstances. And you often see them in the Gospels with the Pharisees because they worked hand in hand. The first time we see the scribes in the life of Jesus is when the Magi, the wise men, came to Herod the Great to seek out where the king was going to be born. And Herod went to the scribes to find out, and the scribes were the ones that rightly told him that the Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem. Now, this particular scribe finds Jesus' disciples. He's undoubtedly joined by other scribes who may have been his friends, and the father, he only has one desire. He wants to see his son set free. But the other scribes are there for another reason, and to understand that, we need to understand something they expected about the coming Messiah. Prior to the coming of Jesus, the ancient rabbis separated miracles into two categories. The first were miracles that anyone led by the Spirit of God could do. The Pharisees and rabbis did miracles. They healed people. They cast out demons. Jesus actually references this at one point. He actually reminds them, well, your disciples cast out demons too. However, there were also miracles they believed no human can do. 3 to be specific. And they believed that when the Messiah came, one of the evidences of his messiahship was that he would accomplish those 3 miracles. So Jesus did the first miracle when he healed a leper. No one had actually healed a leper in the history of Israel. Now there had been two, in fact, that had been healed, but not through the action of anyone in Israel. But this activated an investigation. According to Sanhedrin law, if there was any kind of messianic movement, the Sanhedrin, the spiritual rulers of Israel, had to investigate the situation in 2 stages. The first stage was called the stage of observation. A delegation was formed to investigate only by way of observation. They had to observe what was being said, what was being done, and what was being taught. And they were not permitted to ask any questions or raise any objections. After a period of observation, they were to return to Jerusalem and report to the Sanhedrin and give a verdict. Was the movement significant or was the movement insignificant? If the movement was decreed to be significant or insignificant, again, if the movement was decreed to be insignificant, then the matter would be dropped because who cares? But if the movement was declared to be significant, then there would be a second stage of investigation called the stage of interrogation. In this stage, they would interrogate the individual or members of the movement. This time, they would ask questions and raise objections to discover whether those claims should be accepted or rejected. There's an incident in Luke 5:17 where Jesus heals a paralyzed man, and it records the first stage, the stage of observation. They were there to observe what Jesus was saying and doing. He had healed the leper, and so they're like, oh my goodness, here's one of those messianic miracles. We need to check this out. At that point, they weren't allowed to raise objections or ask any questions. Because a messianic miracle had been performed, all the leaders from all over the country had come to Capernaum to participate in the stage of observation, to observe what Jesus was saying, doing, and teaching. So as Jesus is teaching in this house, 4 friends of a paralyzed man try to bring him to Jesus so he could be healed. And because all the Jewish leaders were blocking the doorway, they weren't able to get in. So they climb onto the roof, make a hole in the roof, and lower the paralyzed man to the feet of Jesus. And of course, you know that story. The gospel record how the Pharisees react when Jesus forgives the man's sins and then heal the man. But remember, they didn't say anything. They were just thinking things. Jesus actually responds to the thoughts in their head. Now that miracle is followed by the Sermon on the Mount and a variety of other teachings. And the Pharisees are there as well, listening to what Jesus is teaching. And Jesus in those times makes it clear he's not going to go along with Pharisaic Judaism. In fact, in every way possible, Jesus is rejecting the Pharisees' interpretation of the Torah and returning people to a correct understanding of God's commands. And they really didn't like it. And so they start seeking ways to kill him. The second messianic miracle occurred on week 26 when Jesus cast a mute demon out of a man in Matthew 12:22 and 23. So when someone would cast out a demon, like one of the Pharisees, they would ask the demon its name. They believed that if you knew the name of the demon, then it gave you the ability to command it, and so you could send it away. You actually see this when Jesus asked the name of the demon in the Gerasene demoniac. What is your name, he says, and the demon says, my name is Legion, for we are many. But if you didn't have the demon's name, you were kind of stuck. As a result, they believed that only the Messiah would be able to cast out a demon who remained nameless. And when Jesus does this miracle, it causes the people in Matthew 12 to ask, is this the son of David, which was a name for the Messiah? Is this the Messiah? This is the second messianic miracle he's done. Maybe this is the one. Of course, the Pharisees, now they're going to respond because this was not their Messiah. They didn't like him at all. And so they accused Jesus of doing miracles by the power of Satan. This is when Jesus talks about blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. But this was their only recourse. I mean, either he was doing it in the power of God and he was the Messiah, or he was getting that power from somewhere else. So Jesus puts them in their place, and the lines are clearly drawn. It's Jesus and his followers versus the Pharisees. Now, as we will see, the boy in this miracle cannot speak. As a result, he can't get the demon's name, so according to what the Jews believed, the demon couldn't be cast out. And this explains what the argument was all about, as the scribes are there arguing with each other. The Pharisees, the father rather, had come seeking Jesus. He is desperate and hoping against hope that maybe this man is the Messiah. I mean, he'd already done 2 of the 3 miracles that only the Messiah could do. And when he gets there, he only finds the 9 disciples. But maybe they can cast out the demon. I mean, they're Jesus' followers after all. But they can't. After all, no one can cast out a nameless demon. Everyone knew that. And so a huge argument ensues. The scribes loved this. I mean, their favorite thing was to argue over the minutia of the law. They loved discussing theology. They weren't concerned with helping people as much as arguing with each other over the best way to interpret a passage of Scripture. And the Father sat by and wept. And this is what Jesus and the 3 disciples coming off the mountain walked into. The text says that when everyone saw Jesus, they were overcome with awe and ran to meet him. The original language actually means to be terrified. The same word is used when the tomb is found empty, and more tellingly, when Jesus is in the garden praying about his death. It says he's overcome with terror, basically. Why would everyone be terrified seeing Jesus? I mean, they'd seen Jesus before. Well, remember that everything in the Bible is connected. Is there another time when someone goes up a mountain, has an encounter with God, and then comes down to confusion and disbelief? Well, as I was praying and working through this, I was drawn back to Moses coming down Mount Sinai with the Torah. He was glowing from his encounter with Yahweh. He came down to find the people worshiping a golden calf, and he's disgusted by their lack of faith. Jesus is the living Torah. He's the law of God made flesh. He's coming down the mountain. He's almost certainly glowing from the transfiguration. He walks into a crowd of unbelief. These people are worshiping an idol of their own making, the religious system that they had created. His anger is on his face, anger over the perpetual desire of some to hold sway over others, anger over religiosity over care. Anger about religiosity over care. So let's go back to the text. What is this arguing all about? Jesus asked. One of the men in the crowd spoke up, knelt before Jesus and said, "Teacher, I have brought my son, my only child, so you could heal him. Lord, have mercy on my son. He is possessed by an evil spirit that won't let him talk. And whenever the spirit seizes him, it throws him violently to the ground. Then he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. He has seizures and suffers terribly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. I begged your disciples to cast out the evil spirit, but they couldn't do it." Now, we just discussed this, but I want you to place yourself in the shoes of the Father, or sandals, as it may be. Your only son has been possessed by this demon for most of his life. We have no idea how old he is now, but I guess he's not a little child anymore. He's probably at least past the age of 13. He's been mutilated during the seizures. His teeth are cracked and broken. When the father dies, his entire lineage will die with him because the boy will never marry and never have children. In fact, it's likely he'll never reach true adulthood. Everything the Father knows about miracles tells him there is no answer here, but he comes to Jesus anyway. Of course, the other scribes aren't here for that. In fact, they are using this man's son to try and discredit Jesus. Can you imagine? I mean, Jesus had already cast out a mute demon, so that second sign had been done. The religious leaders were looking for ways to discredit Jesus because he didn't fit their image of who the Messiah should be. They waited until Jesus was away, and then they pounced. They dragged this poor man and his afflicted son for the disciples to heal. They figured that if Jesus' Talmud, his followers, couldn't cast out the demon, then it would cast doubt on Jesus being the Messiah. The disciples couldn't, and you can imagine the smug satisfaction in the hearts of the other scribes. Never mind that this father, their friend, is weeping, and the son is still possessed by a demon. Back to the text. Jesus said to them, "You faithless and corrupt people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me." So they brought the boy. But when the evil spirit saw Jesus, it threw the child into a violent convulsion, and he fell to the ground, writhing and foaming at the mouth. "How long has this been happening?" Jesus asked the boy's father. He replied, "Since he was a little boy. The spirit often throws him into the fire or into the water, trying to kill him. Have mercy on us and help us if you can." "What do you mean, if I can?" Jesus asked. "Anything is possible if a person believes." The father instantly cried out, "I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw that the crowd of onlookers was growing, he rebuked the evil spirit. "Listen, you spirit that makes this boy unable to hear and speak," he said, "I command you to come out of this child and never enter him again." Then the spirit screamed and threw the boy into another violent convulsion and left him. The boy appeared to be dead. A murmur ran through the crowd as the people said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and helped him to his feet, and he stood up. Then he gave him back to his father. All gripped the people as they saw this majestic display of God's power. So Jesus seems pretty frustrated with what's happening. When you read this passage without understanding what's going on underneath, you might think Jesus is calling the disciples faithless and corrupt. I mean, that's what I always thought. They weren't able to do the miracle, right? They didn't have enough faith. But of course, knowing all of the other things, we understand that Jesus is actually condemning the scribes. They are faithless because they won't accept him as Messiah. They are corrupt because they are willing to leave this man's son in agony rather than see him healed. Then the father asked Jesus to heal his son, if he can. And Jesus' response is epic. I love this. "What do you mean, if I can?" Then he references believing. So let's review. Belief is what I know that changes what I do. I know who God is, so I act in accordance with his commands. And the man's response is telling. It's an odd sentence in Greek that makes it difficult to translate, which is why if you look at various English translations, you get various sentences. What it literally says is, "I believe, help of me the unbelief." What in the world is this man saying? Of course, he wasn't speaking Greek. In Hebrew, he would have said something like this: "Here I am believing, but I lack faith." The man does something amazing. He owns what Jesus said earlier. He recognizes his faithlessness. He doesn't mentally doubt. He just finds himself unable to do more than proclaim his readiness. He wants to demonstrate complete trust, but he doesn't know how. He wants to believe on behalf of his son, but he is held back. He's held back by his preconceptions on what is possible. He's held back by his upbringing. He's held back by the fact that up until this very moment, he had certainly been working against Jesus. So why should Jesus heal his son? But Jesus accepts what the Father has to give, that little bit, and casts out the demon. It reconfirms the miracle he did earlier, amazes the crowd, and shuts up the scribes. Back to the text. Afterward, when Jesus was alone in the house with his disciples, they asked him, "Why couldn't we cast out that evil spirit?" "You don't have enough faith," Jesus told them. "I tell you the truth, if you had faith even as small as a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it would move. Nothing would be impossible. This kind can only be cast out by prayer." So when they get alone, the disciples ask about their inability to cast out the demon. Remember, in their minds, casting out the demon required knowing its name, and the demon couldn't speak. They didn't believe. But what Jesus is doing here is a rabbinic teaching tool called from light to heavy. Jesus is not teaching that anything you wish to do, you'll be able to do if you have faith. "Hey, God, I have faith that you will give me $1 million. There are people that actually teach that. What he's doing is he is comparing two kinds of faith. The context of this statement is the failure of his disciples to exorcise the demon from the boy. This failure leads to an obvious question. Why couldn't we remove the demon? And Jesus' comment is about the mistaken conclusion that super faith is somehow different than ordinary faith. "Oh, you know what? I have faith, but I don't have faith like that person over here. That guy's like Superman faith." What he says, in essence, is that even the smallest faith is sufficient if used by God. The comparison with impossible things reflects a rabbinic view that extraordinary works of the Spirit can be accomplished through the most ordinary believers. In fact, this is the story of the entire Old Testament. Over and over again, these stories tell us that the flawed human people can do amazing things if God is with them. Think about Samson. The example of moving mountains is not to suggest that any kind of physically impossible act may be done through some spiritual means, but rather to teach that even the most insignificant faith is more than enough for God. Jesus' statement is rabbinic hyperbole aimed at teaching his disciples not to consider their failures to accomplish their goals as grounds for questioning their relationship with God. Faith is not a measurable commodity, but a relationship. And what achieves results through prayer is not a superior quantity of faith, but the unlimited power of God on which faith, any faith, can draw. If I draw close to God, He will draw close to me. When God is near, amazing things can happen. That's why Jesus says this can only happen through prayer. All prayer does is it draws us into relationship with the Father. And so when I am close to God and I have a little faith, God can use that to do amazing things. Back to the text. Leaving that region, they traveled through Galilee. Jesus didn't want anyone to know he was there, for he wanted to spend more time with his disciples and teach them. He's preparing them for his death. After they gathered again in Galilee, he said to them, "Listen to me and remember what I say. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. He will be killed, but 3 days later he will rise from the dead." And the disciples were filled with grief, but they didn't know what he meant. Its significance was hidden from them, so they couldn't understand it, and they were afraid to ask him about it. So we end here with Jesus telling the disciples what is going to happen fairly shortly. This is the first time he clearly told them that he was going to die and then be raised to life. Their reaction is not completely surprising, but it does raise some questions. Why were they filled with grief? Jesus did say he would die, but then he said he was coming back to life. So, yay! That would make them sad, but then happy, right? Our problem is that we see this from the other side. So we focus on the resurrection part. We know how the story ends. It's like watching The Empire Strikes Back for the first time. Everything is bad. The rebellion is on the run. Luke needs to go to a secondhand store. It's dark. But then we watch The Return of the Jedi and everything is good again. The good guys win, the bad guys lose, Anakin is redeemed. Hooray! Everything's great. So now when I watch The Empire Strikes Back, I see it through the lens of the end of the story. But it wasn't like that the first time. The disciples only saw Jesus' statement from their point of view. They only saw Jesus' death because that made sense to them. They understood death. Resurrection? What can that mean? I mean, it's true they had seen Jesus resurrect people, but that's Jesus. Once he dies, who's going to do it for him? Plus, they may have been more influenced by the Sadducees than they knew. The Sadducees taught there was no resurrection, and maybe they had internalized that somehow. Their lack of understanding was so complete that even faced with the evidence of the resurrection, the empty tomb, they still didn't understand what was happening. It wasn't until Jesus showed up and spoke with them that they finally got it. The box of what they knew was so tightly shut they couldn't see anything else. So they walked in grief for weeks until Jesus returned from the grave. So this event in the life of Jesus is all about belief. We see 3 groups of people showing 3 levels of belief. And as I often like to do with events like this, I want to invite you to think about who you are in the story. Excuse me. First, let's talk about the scribes. What did they believe? They believed that their made-up rules were more important than God's simple commands, so they rejected anyone who questioned them. They believed Jesus was dangerous, so they conspired to kill him. They believed their system had to be protected at all costs, so they were willing to see a boy continue to suffer horribly so they could discredit Jesus. Jesus called them faithless and corrupt. You see, everyone believes in something. We all have faith in something. We all worship some God, small g. The religious people of Jesus' day worshiped the God that is truly at the center of all man-made worship, themselves. They wanted to do whatever it took to remain in power, and they were willing to sacrifice anything and anyone on the altar of their God. Ultimately, they sacrificed Jesus. Of course, that didn't work out really well for them, did it? But do you see yourself in the scribes? Most people who call themselves Christians would look at the scribes in this story and smugly point to drug abusers and the alcoholics and the homosexuals and the pornographers. Those are the people who are faithless and corrupt. They're the bad ones. But let's be honest. How did Jesus react to people like that? He ate with them. He called them to follow him, and he loved them. No, the scribes were the people seen as the most religious in their society, the ones who knew the Bible better than anyone. Today, these are the people sitting in the church Sunday after Sunday, arguing over the minutiae of theology while ignoring the needs of the lost right across the street. These are the people who condemn anyone who does church differently, all while maintaining a system that is driving the lost away and destroying the church. These are the people who will sacrifice anyone and anything on the altar of their own selfish desires, on their altar of their need to have things their way. The scribe is, well, me, and maybe it's you. Because here's the truth. We all have a little of the scribe in us. The minute we forget that is the moment we become the thing we may hate. I don't think anyone begins following Jesus with the intent of becoming faithless and corrupt, but that is the direction we will all go if we are not constantly vigilant. If you see even a little of this in you, let me encourage you to cast it away, repent, and return to that passionate faith you had at the beginning. Don't let your desires drive you. The second group is the disciples. The disciples weren't corrupt so much as they were clueless. Their thinking was so boxed in by what they had been taught growing up, they couldn't hear the very clear words Jesus was saying. They couldn't do the mighty works of God because they couldn't imagine anything bigger than what they already knew was possible. But God wants us to believe the impossible. He wants us to confront a problem that has no solution and press on, trusting Him for the result. In one of my devotional readings yesterday, I got this, which says it all. Is there someone in your life who has an approach to faith that borders on reckless, impulsive, or even foolish? Do you wish you had that same kind of faith? Then learn to dream. Maybe you're the person who clings to security, balances the checkbooks, and attempts to control your universe while the dreamer in your life is changing his world through the power of faith in God. You can bet he's a dreamer. He isn't ignorant of the obstacles that stand between him and the dream God has planted in his heart. He just knows God is far greater than the obstacles. Make this declaration. I commit to be just crazy enough to follow God wherever He leads. The more implausible, the better. As you watch the dream unfold, you'll be breathless with gratitude and awe. The experience will lift you to a new level of faith you've never experienced before. But you must be willing to hold on to the dream and to stand strong when others criticize, laugh, or try to rein you in. Lynn Bogle, CDO of the Nashville Rescue Mission, which houses hundreds of homeless men at a time, made this statement. God says to us, you know what? I'll take care of it. You just dream, and I'll take care of it. The it to which he was referring is a $12 million budget. What's your it? Today, ask yourself this question. Am I willing to dream and let God take care of the impossibilities? Finally, let's look at the Father. Jesus said that all it took was a tiny bit of faith to do impossible things. It's faith born out of a closeness to God. The father of the boy had that, just a little. Isn't it interesting that the best example of faith is the one who recognized he didn't have enough and needed help? The disciples thought they had it under control. The scribes thought they had a lock on understanding God, but not this father. Do you know what led him to this point? Desperation. He was desperate to see his son healed. He was desperate because he knew he was undeserving. He was desperate because all his learning had gotten him nowhere. He was desperate because he was alone among the people who should have been his friends. And in that moment of desperation, God showed up. In Matthew 5, Jesus begins his sermon by saying, "You're so lucky when you are desperate and knowing you have no hope. Because of your desperation, God is among you." We don't need faith when everything is good. We don't need to believe when we think we have a handle on things. We only need those things. We only need faith when life is spinning out of control, when we have no other recourse, when we're desperate. The truth is, we all are in a desperate state all the time. We just don't always know it. We try to numb it with substances or relationships or religion. We do anything to ignore our desperation because we don't like needing to depend on another. The problem is, it's only in our moments of desperation that we truly see God act. So let me invite you to look past your pride and consider your true state, the desperate circumstances you are truly in. But maybe you are truly desperate today. Maybe you know you need Jesus more than ever. Well, guess what? He is coming down the mountain to do that miracle. All you need is a grain of faith, just enough belief to lift your eyes and ask. And you know what the cool thing is? When you're healed, you get to be a witness and heal others. So accept the healing Jesus wants to give you, and then get out on your mission to share that with others. God bless you, and have a great week.